Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ohio Valley Real Estate Report. My name is Johnny Kazemka with my partner Scott Connors. Good morning.
How's it going, everybody?
Anyways, we are broadcasting live from the St. Clairsville, Ohio office studio.
We're broadcasting live from the Connors Group worldwide headquarters.
the headquarters. So anyways, today we are talking about interest rates, their impact on the general market, especially the Ohio Valley market, how to navigate them, all of the gloom and doom that we've been experiencing through the years, and I guess what you can do about it. So, Scott, what you got?
Yeah, by far the single biggest question I get from everyone I run into that wants to talk real estate is what's going on with interest rates.
Sure.
And the answer is they're high, at least compared to what we've seen.
They're high, but are they, high? They're high in comparison.
Right. And of course, neither of us is old enough to say, well, the first house I bought in 1985, I paid 18%, right?
Well, and there's always that debate. And I actually remember my mother being enthusiastic to refinance her mortgage before I even knew what real estate was. I mean, this is how young I still remember the conversation about refinancing at like 10%.
Right.
This is back in the 90s. So, they're high in retrospect of what they were 2 years ago. But as far as, historically speaking, they're low.
Yeah, they're not bad at all. And part of the answer is everyone just needs to adjust to the new normal, right? This is what we're going to have for a while. I don't think we're going to see 3.5% for any time in the near future.
Sure.
But here's what I do know: people are still going to be buying houses. People who need to buy a house, people who need to sell a house, they're going to buy a house or they're going to sell a house. It never changes.
Sure. So at least in my world, what I've experienced lately is the drought that, at least I would call it a drought, has been people that currently own or that bought in the last maybe 5 to 10 years that have bought at a lower interest rate are not looking forward to selling their house and seeing all the equity that they've accrued through that 5 to 10 year period go down the drain for inheriting a higher interest rate. Put it this way. There's really three things that drive, at least I think, our business. The 3 Ds: death, divorce, and diapers.
Right.
And so if you're outside of one of those categories and you have the option to not sell, then you're not going to basically just take that leap and inherit a higher interest rate. That has led to lack of listing volume. That has led to, a little bit higher demand, if you will.
Right.
So you would think higher interest rates would be counterintuitive, lesser demand.
But here's the interesting thing. Mm-hmm. Nobody dies, nobody gets divorced, and nobody has a baby based on interest rates.
Precisely.
So those things are all going to keep happening. And also people in those situations, they don't really have a choice, right?
Correct.
You're going to have to buy that house or sell that house. I mean, within reason, of course, which it was fascinating to me when we were talking about what to do for this podcast today, is two of the most common, most popular topics in podcasting right now are high interest rates and how they're, suppressing the market, and how to buy a house in a highly competitive market. And those two things shouldn't coexist.
No, not at all.
But they clearly do. It's been our personal experience too, right? My phone's not ringing like it normally does. We've definitely gotten quiet out there. At the same time, talk to buyers who've missed out on the last 3 houses that hit the market because there were better offers than theirs.
Well, it's two different waves of demand. And in fact, I think we talked about this in a different podcast. The demand generally from the low interest rate boom, if you call it demand number one, was driven because everybody was jumping in the pool, taking advantage. Everybody knew, at least if you had financial, call it common sense, that this is your outlier opportunity to take advantage of all these different buyer programs. COVID made a wonderful mess and everybody just jumped into this together. And now the demand is actually being driven by lack of inventory.
Sure, it's classic supply and demand, right? It's both sides of it.
But demand is demand.
That's correct. Demand is demand, but the supply hasn't gone up. Typically in a slow market, there's more supply, less demand, right? Prices come down. We've not seen that at all. In fact, listing volume in my 15-year career is at an all-time low. And I think you touched on it. Someone who bought a house, 3 or 4 years ago, we see a very common cycle of a 3 or 4 year move, right? A home gets sold, comes back on the market in about 3 years. It's staggering how often that happens.
Sure.
Well, now that guy who bought the house 3 years ago is sitting at 3.5% on his mortgage. It is tough to pull the trigger unless you're forced to by life circumstances. It's tough to pull the trigger and go to, now what's looking like mid 7s, maybe low 8s at this point, could go higher.
Yeah.
So the result is they don't make the move. We'll call that a voluntary move, right? They don't have to.
Sure.
So that means there's less inventory on the market, which is less supply, which means prices more demand.
Yeah.
So the overall tone of the market, in my experience, and according to the figures as well, is it's still a seller's market. There's not much inventory. There are plenty of buyers out there,
Mm-hmm.
and that flies in the face of what conventional wisdom would be, and maybe what a lot of media reporting is about interest rates.
Well, most people focus. It's a macroscopic level that I feel like when you watch CNN or Fox News. I don't care what news affiliate that you want to subscribe to.
Right.
The message is the same, and they focus at a macroscopic level. Real estate impending crash and all these things, and it probably will happen. You know, I think you know, if you look at some of the data but I'm not saying that should be something. Put it this way: the Ohio Valley is relatively immune, in my opinion, to large-scale economic factors. We round out the bottom of most major indexes, from population density to median levels of income. When recession looks at California staring back at West Virginia, not the other way around. So when these gloom and doom things, if you're reacting to that, take a deep breath again and kind of relax. The Ohio Valley is immune to it.
So there are two factors there. Number one, you're right. We historically have not seen great fluctuations up or down in real estate values and buying activity. It's been a consistent upswing into the long time past, right?
Sure.
We see appreciation of a couple % a year, typically, some isolated incidences. But that's so we're different in that way, coupled with the fact that all the areas in the country that work like that don't make the news. Nobody gets on the news and says, by the way, real estate was pretty calm today. Nothing really happened.
Yeah.
Prices didn't really go up or down dramatically. They're kind of the same as they were. And so when you have a market like a Las Vegas or a Detroit where things are absolutely spiraling out of control up or crashing down, sure, that's where the news is. But in all the hinterlands, which is pretty much everywhere else, where you don't have a ton of foreclosures, you don't see massive price swings, that doesn't make the news.
Yeah, and we subscribe to just a general illness. The entire population is what you see is all there is, and
Yes.
if you keep hearing it over and over again, it becomes this sort of truth, even if you don't even understand what you're hearing.
I was recently reading about survivor bias, which is a fascinating concept, and I think it applies here as well.
Sure.
So if you start watching the news and you hear story after story of, well, I bought my house 3 years ago and the bottom dropped out in the market, I lost $100,000. Those are anecdotes. No one's talking to the person who bought their house 3 years ago, and it's worth a little more now than it was then.
Correct.
Because it's not interesting. And so, survivor bias is when we talk about how we didn't wear seatbelts in the 80s and we didn't wear helmets for our bikes. Well, we can all talk about it, and we were fine, right?
Sure.
Well, because all the people who died aren't here to tell the story.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same idea, because again, it doesn't make the news. And so most people I know, virtually everyone I know, virtually every house I've ever sold is worth more today than it was when they bought it. And it doesn't matter if they bought it 10 years ago or 6 months ago. That's what our market does.
Yeah, I mean, geez, there's houses that have doubled within the last 12 months. Doubled.
Absolutely. I mean, the houses you and I have sold,
Yeah.
as recently as a couple years ago, are coming back on the market at much higher prices, and they're getting it because there is still demand there.
Even with higher interest rates.
Even with higher interest rates. And so I think that's the overall takeaway, is that do interest rates affect the market? Absolutely. If you're spending, say, $100,000, say $200,000, the difference in payment might be a couple $100 a month now compared to where it was a couple years ago. But it doesn't mean they're not going to buy a house. They're either going to stretch the budget to get there anyway. Maybe they buy a little bit less house, but that house is still going to sell. And again, I've not seen any change in the idea that if a good house comes on the market at a good price, it's going to sell quickly.
Yeah.
I had one, just a quick anecdote, just a couple weeks ago, got word from another agent his house was coming on the market. I had a buyer for it. We were in there within hours of it hitting the MLS, and we wrote an over asking price offer.
Because you have to.
And guess what? Interest rates are higher than they were before, but we're still doing that. And my buyer's experience had been, I better do this or I'm going to lose this house.
Yeah, and that's been the tone of the Ohio Valley real estate market probably for the better half of the last decade.
Easily. I mean, I'm 10, 12 years in now?
About 12.
Something like
good.
that?
Yeah.
Have you seen a slowdown? Have you seen a time where you really couldn't sell anything?
Arguably the closest it's ever become to a buyer's market as when the interest rates were low. And that's because there was more, well, there's always more buyers than sellers, but it was so aggressive to the point where...
But even that statement you just made, let me cut you off there. When you say there are always more buyers than sellers, that's been our experience in our, in the grand scheme of things, relatively short careers. I mean, I feel like an old veteran, you are too. But, 15, 12 years is not that long. If you look at 100 years worth of market trends.
Sure.
But we're wired, because it's been our experience, that there are always more buyers than sellers, which means it's always been a seller's market.
Sure.
By definition, right? And
Yeah.
and an uptick in interest rates hasn't changed that.
No, not at all. And that was the predictable outcome. And if you turn on Fox, if you turn on CNN, that's the message that you're probably hearing at the macroscopic level.
Absolutely.
But if you can recall things like the recession of 2008, how difficult was life in the Ohio Valley? It wasn't easy,
Yeah.
but it wasn't like you were literally losing your entire life savings because your home's equity. I mean, usually your home is one of the biggest assets that you're going to have.
Yep.
And when that goes away, it's really hard. How do you sell a house that you bought for $300,000 when it now crashes and it's now worth $200,000 within a year? You don't.
Well, you don't, but guess what? That doesn't happen around here.
Correct. So when people, I have these conversations with, call them, I want to call it the old guard, but the parents and the father-in-laws and the family that comes to the rescue of the first-time buyer. Oh, you shouldn't be buying in this market. Hold off. That advice, because it comes from this source, is much more reliable to you as your first-time buyer. You're going to trust your father over me.
Yep.
I would expect you to. I wouldn't even want to insert myself in between you. But if you would just at least take a look at this, look at the market data here. And I'm suggesting that if you wait, those of you that are watching this and continue waiting now, if you are on the fence and watching this podcast, if you're waiting, I can almost all but assure you, waiting is going to be the bigger detriment than jumping into it now.
You paraphrase something I say all the time, but we got to be careful because we're going to start to sound like salesmen.
Yeah.
I don't think either one of us is a very good salesman.
My job is not in sales, and I say it's consultation.
But the truth is, we love what we do and we take it very seriously. I can say without much hesitation at all that every single person, and there have been many, dozens if not hundreds of people in my career who've said to me, you know what, I'm not going to buy now. I'm going to wait for this bust. I'm going to wait for this bubble to burst. I'm going to wait for the market to come back to reality. Mm-hmm. Every one of them ends up paying more for their house because they waited than had they bought when they told me that the market was overinflated, because the trend line has been almost 100% up.
Yeah, it's always, I say, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That
Right.
describes you how we're always moving forward.
That's right.
Slowly moving forward. So when's the best time to buy?
Now?
Yeah,
Well,
five years ago.
Yeah. The best time, but that's the best time to buy. The real answer to that question is the best time to buy is when you need to buy.
Yeah.
If you're in the market to buy, evaluate the market, get good advice, make a good decision. Don't overpay because it's inflated. But if you're trying to time the real estate market, especially around here,
Yeah.
for waiting for prices to come down, you're going to lose.
Yeah, 100% of the time. That works probably in larger scale markets where
Sure.
they have, upswings of $100,000 a year.
I have clients who also buy and sell in Florida, and they've done very well with that. So there have been isolated neighborhoods and areas that went through a severe downturn. They snapped up some properties pretty inexpensively. That market does come back up. You try that around here, it's not going to happen. That's not how you make money in real estate. There are plenty of ways to do that. That's a different story, another podcast, but
Sure.
that's not it.
So I guess what would be your best advice then for you navigating, which we kind of tripped over a little bit or stumbled over, but what would you say?
So I think that I'm a numbers guy, and I work well with clients who appreciate that analysis. We don't have all the answers. We don't have a crystal ball, but I would say you get advice from people who've been around, who can really look at the numbers. Yeah, I can't give you a straight answer because I keep bouncing around on topics, but a frustration for me is when someone makes kind of a generic statement of, well, everything I see is, or I see all these houses coming on the market and not selling. Or the house down the street, or everything around me selling for a certain price. Give me the numbers, give me the addresses, give me specific data, and then we'll talk about it. Because that perception, kind of the theme of this podcast we stumbled into, is that perception of what you hear on the news, of the horror stories, or the great stories. That's not reality. Reality is the transactions that are happening every single day, and what do those numbers look like? What specifically did the house down the street sell for, when? And analyze all those numbers and then make a good decision. I would say that trying to time the market almost never works. A close relation to this, and I just had a couple of these conversations this week, is people who've been wanting to sell, and for whatever reason their houses didn't sell. There are some properties that don't sell for various reasons. Well, I'm going to take it off the market for the winter and try to sell it next year.
Sure.
I think that's a terrible plan, because the thinking, I believe, for most people is, my house is likely not going to sell in the wintertime, so I might as well wait till spring. Well, guess what? If you take it off the market, I guarantee it's not going to sell in the wintertime.
Yeah.
So why not leave it out there? There are going to be buyers. You and I both have sold houses and had closings on New Year's Eve. And so there are buyers year round. And so when you pull your house off the market, you're taking what might be a slim chance and making it zero.
Yeah. Well, have you seen the numbers of percentage list price versus sales price?
I
The
haven't.
fluctuation.
No.
Do you know what months they usually get the most percentage out of list versus sales price?
So this is how much stuff is selling for relative to the asking price.
Correct.
What you're
Percentage versus list versus sales price.
enlighten me.
It's usually in the final quarter of the year, November, December, and even through the first quarter of the following year in January.
Interesting.
You get typically higher percentage, and it's not. I don't have a direct answer to that, but my belief would be that a lot of times the market does tend to slow down, the seasonal adjustment, if you will, and if there's lack of listings on the market, you have less competition. Therefore, you get closer to the asking price.
So I'll flip your question around. When's the best time to sell?
Well, again, it's I think when I'll answer it with your answer when you're ready.
When you're ready to sell, right? That's what you do.
Yeah. The reality of this is, if you're focusing on one topic and we're talking about a specific topic, interest rates, if that's all you're focusing on, you're bound to lose. Failure to plan means you might as well plan to fail.
Yep.
Okay. It's lost on me how many people forget about refinancing. Seriously.
For sure.
So if you really have, it's completely appropriate to speculate on what's going to happen in any market: real estate, stocks, houses, shoes, cars. I don't care what it is. If you're going to make a wise financial decision, okay, speculate on it, but don't just gravitate to the one, facet, one area. I've always said my best advice for this market: date the rate, marry the house.
Yeah.
And trust that the Ohio Valley market over the last 100 years has always had a slow trend line worth growing up or going upwards. So, you're going to have equity one way or the other.
Without question. A couple other things that have come up lately that through most of our careers hasn't been discussed is things like discount points. And, what are some ways to, let me rephrase the question. I'll ask you directly and you can ask me back if you want. What are some ways to help a buyer in an environment where interest rates are higher to either get a lower rate or a better deal? What have you been doing to work around that?
Sure. Well, as far as discount points, they have been a topic of discussion for this year. I've always advised looking at the fine print of discount points. You'll see, online lenders that say finance today at 6%,
Right.
But it doesn't mean 6%. It's 6% with how many points you're buying. And interest rate points aren't just, I spend X amount of dollars to shave off 1%. If that was the case, you would just keep doing that, whatever the cost would be. And it fluctuates almost hourly. It's really that. The other thing that I had leaned into would be assumptions. FHA mortgages, for example, are all assumable. So you could take advantage of someone else's lower interest rate with doing that and getting financed that way. But outside of that, I haven't really seen much else in the terms of.
So one of my favorite tricks has been the West Virginia Housing Fund program. There's a function in there where, and that's a more complicated topic than we'll cover now.
Sure.
But it can actually dramatically lower that rate. So in an environment where we're seeing 7.5, maybe low 8s in some cases, with the right lender in the right program, and these are somewhat unusual programs. I'm going to say that again.
They're
So
government. Yeah.
So in an environment with rates at 7.5 and maybe low 8s, getting to the right lender with a somewhat unusual program can dramatically see that. I remember seeing an email come out from one of our favorite lenders that they could do 5.5 in a time when everything else was 7.5. And just by picking the right lender, picking the right loan. Now, that's not just a lender offering a better deal. Let me be clear.
Sure.
It's a specific program with specific requirements, but there are a lot of people who don't know about it. And so, again, if you're a buyer's agent and you're making an offer on something and your buyer's getting 2% off their rate, they're in a much better position to maybe offer a little bit more, come in stronger than a buyer who's is stretching their budget because they're sitting at 8.25.
Yeah, this goes back to another podcast, and I'll just change gears real quick. But you said, as a buyer's agent, the amount of people that call the sign in the yard and then stick with that particular person. You already know where I'm going with this. If I drove up, you're a car guy. If I drove up to a mechanic,
Indeed.
If I drove up to a mechanic and I said, "Hey, I need a water pump fixed," and they brought out a Cobalt toolbox that had like 5 tools in it, and said, "Yeah, okay, I got this," I would drive away as fast as I can. If I pull up and they have the lifts and everything else, all the tools in the world that they can have, and I see that, you're hired. That's what I encourage buyers, even my own buyers. Talk to someone. I'm not always the best fit for buying, but it's these kind of things, these little anecdotes of knowledge that set the tone for, especially in the difficult markets, especially what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
If you're not having these conversations with your buyer's agent, you really should. And you'll find out very quick whether they're someone you want to keep around or someone you want to jump ship.
And I think the big point you're trying to make is be very selective. Like, be intentional about who you're going to work with. Don't just call the name on the sign. That person may be a great listing agent and not a great buyer's agent, may not be a very good agent at all, or they might be the best there is.
Correct.
But you should be asking this question, because that kind of advice, the stuff we're talking about with getting you to the right lender, knowing that other rate is out there as an example, that saves you thousands of dollars down the road and gives you a better chance of getting the house you want, all because you asked a couple questions. I always welcome the interview process. It doesn't happen very often, but I'll have someone call me and say, we're thinking about buying, we're interviewing agents. Absolutely, let's sit down and talk. And you're right, maybe I'm not a good fit for you, but if I'm not, go find someone who is.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it doesn't happen as often as I would imagine it would. But,
yeah, it's surprising.
Sure. Well, anything else you want to add as far as this podcast?
No, I think we did great.
So, all right, guys. Well, we'll be back next week with a different podcast, different topic. Scott, as always, thank you for joining in.
Thank you, my man.
We'll see you next time.
Take care.